Beginning. Okay, great. So Manus Midlarsky, it's a real pleasure to have you here and to be able to speak to you today. You've done a lot of work in a very long and illustrious career. You've worked on issues of causes of war, revolution, terrorism. You've also done significant work on the relation between inequality, democracy, and development, as well as more recently on questions of genocide, mass killing, and political extremism. And throughout your career, you've also done substantial work on methodological issues in the social sciences, on measurement and modeling as well. And in light of this, this body of work, I was wondering if we could begin simply with a question of what research of yours are you most proud of?
I think the answer would be what recently the Killing Trap came out with Cambridge in '05 and recently cited in several publications and the European Journal of International Relations and Annual Review of Sociology and other places as well, and Perspectives on Politics. And so I think that is making an impact. And I think maybe we ought to distinguish between what makes an impact and what I'm proud of. Most recently, I'm proud of The Origins of Political Extremism that came out 2 years ago, 2011, also with Cambridge. And I think it's my best work because it covers not only issues of, what causes extremist-induced violence, but also the ethical issues involved, the future projections of what happens to extremism of various types, and why I feel so that it's so important, because so many lives were lost as a result of extremism, particularly during the interwar period and then into World War II and beyond, into other forms of radical extremism. So that is most recent. Okay. Moving back in time, the handbooks of war studies that I see are two of which are still displayed at the University of Michigan Press downstairs, in the book exhibit. I think that's been an education for people. And so I'm proud of all that recent work that spans, let's say, the past 15 years or so. Going back in time, I feel I did have an impact. I feel this is having an impact now, this current work. But going back in time, the most significant work, I think, was work on modeling of certain kinds of inequality. For example, a pattern inequality came out in the APSR in 1988, and that still was recently cited in Science, which I felt really good about. Science magazine had a special issue on human conflict, and there was one contribution that had the greatest number of political scientists cited, and I was quoted from that article. So it still apparently is having an impact, and I felt really good about that article and several other APSR pieces, one in '84 on political parties and party systems, and that article was used by me to predict Reagan's second-term victory without any data on interview data or any polling data whatsoever, solely based on the pattern of elections that the mathematical model I developed, predicted. More recently, the second Bush victory also was predicted by some political scientists at Stony Brook, whose name I forget, but I think it appeared in PS or some, journal devoted to more current affairs. That is so I was very dedicated to systematic research. In some sense, I followed, even though I was not a student of his at Michigan, I followed Dave Singer's dictum about reproducibility, about systematic work.
And Correlates of War project.
The Correlates of War, yes, right. that I had early exposure to, and in fact the data which I used on my dissertation. That became the basis of my first book, on war, political violence, and the international system. And I think that book had an impact in terms of showing how quantitative work can be used to understand important factors like the origins of war, but also that it could be used in outside of an article format in which you're more constrained and you have the tables and so forth. I had that in the book, but it was spread throughout, and others then, I can't say who, but others I think were inspired by that effort that came out in 1975, that then led in the following decade to other books being published, Buena de Mosquito's War Trap, and Kugler, Argansky and Kugler's War, I forget, but also War, and in the following decades. So I think that had an impact on people feeling they had the capability of writing books that could use quantitative methods and mathematical models as well to make explanations that appear to be empirically valid.
And a lot of your work has gone back and forth between quantitative and qualitative methods as well. Some of your more recent work, for instance, the Killing Trap, for instance, is largely qualitative work.
Yes.
So you've really kind of spanned the types of different methods that you use, it seems.
Yes, and the reason I did that why I didn't give up on quantitative work. I'm doing some now, even as we speak. I have a project ongoing, particularly experimental work on testing the ephemeral game theory that is part of the origins of political extremism, that is based on historical material, but that is now being exposed to experimental testing in a couple of locations in the New York area, New York, New Jersey area. So no, I'm in no way abandoning that, but I sensed that for the first, well, at least my first major cut into genocide work, as opposed to focusing on the Holocaust as the major genocidal event of the 20th century, that I want to do in a comparative way. I want to include the Armenians, and I want to include the Tutsi in Rwanda, as well as, in a somewhat different vein, the Cambodians and Bosnian Muslims in the the Srebrenica genocide declared so by the United Nations, 1994 or 5. So I became influenced by the Donald Green, Shapiro orientation to not only experimentation, but also to problem solving. That is, choosing a problem as opposed to being wedded to a method. And I think that's important.
So problem-driven, as they talk about.
Yes,
Right.
Problem-driven research that I think has been very influential coming out of the Yale department. And I think it's correct. I think that's what we have to do before we start assigning numbers to things or even tell stories about things in a qualitative research. We need to have some sense of what the problem is and how do you define the problem. What are the dimensions of the problem? And the Killing Trap, despite being qualitative, as I just was told by somebody who's using it in the class, is seen as one of the more difficult words for graduate students at a major, I won't mention the university, major university, and they were also using the Handbook of War Studies 3. These students were getting me from two sides, or so I was told by this faculty member at that institution. And he said he didn't do it, and I certainly didn't do it, but it felt good hearing that. But it nevertheless is not seen as an easy work, despite the fact that there's very few numbers in it other than page numbers. And the origins of political extremism, I think, is also at the same level. I haven't seen the reception yet as I have with the Killing Trap. And even I just, in the past year or so, just really seen the influence of the Killing Trap. I had not seen it before. And that, how many years? That it took 7 years.
Yeah, well, it seems that it's also had an impact in kind of related research areas in the sense of it's gotten attention in comparative politics and political science, but also in interdisciplinary fields like genocide studies,
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
and other areas like that. So it's certainly gotten attention from a number of different kinds of research communities.
Yeah, yeah. Well, which I'm very pleased about, obviously. I spent a lot of time in the book, and I thought I did a reasonably good job. I think I feel more comfortable about the origins of political extremism because it covers a broader territory. It doesn't just focus on those maybe 4 or 5 cases I just mentioned you in the killing trap, but it covers genocides, it covers Stalin's depredations in Ukraine and Soviet Union, fascism, Italian fascism, which, you know, the Italians are rightly noted for their restraint and even aid during the Holocaust, but very few people know about what happened in Libya or in Ethiopia, in which as many as 500,000 more people died, Africans there. So fascism, was instrumental in that, obviously, as an ideology. Problem of radical Islamism, that in the end of the book, I think I was right, is in a decline for reasons I gave. I hope that's a correct overall long-term prediction. It's not, obviously not tomorrow. So I feel good about that book, and I hope it does have an impact. The problem is that The Killing Trap, I didn't even do this intentionally, but it was targeting a certain community, that is a community of genocide scholars, that was emerging. There is a group of scholars of extremism, but it's not as well defined. There is an organization, but it's very loose on the web. And I've had contact with them, went to one conference, but they're spread over the map in terms of what they want to look at. A lot of them want to look at extremism in Europe, and there's an anti-immigrant sentiment in terms of proto-fascism, but nothing like the kind of mass violence that I was looking at the origins of political extremism. So I'm not sure which community is going to be influenced by that. And right now, I'm working on a project aside from the experimental test of the eternal gain, because I think it's an important psychological mechanism that really nobody had thought of. I mean, the bare bones were there, but I added a couple of Phillips to it that made it, I think, into a theory that can be tested. But what I'm working on now is protraction of conflict, how conflict gets protracted over time. And right now I'm looking at the consequence of World War I, protraction of World War I, and I'm still debating whether I want to put the Civil War in there. It's a comparison of Civil War between World War I, which crosses the boundaries between Civil War and interstate war, which is not, it's been a kind of porous boundary, but it still exists. It's a boundary. And I think I'm crossing it, I'm not sure yet. But I know the final piece that'll come out as part of the book, and I'll try to get published separately, is the impact of World War I on the Holocaust in Europe. And this is using certain more general conclusions, like from Shaw. Reading Shaw's article, I got an idea. And then one can ask the question, why genocide against blacks did not occur? There was atrocity. In fact, the thing is called right now, the title is A Path to Atrocity. Defense of the homeland in protracting the American Civil War and World War I. Got defense of the homeland, deals with hierarchies, and it's got some quantification in there, but really not that much. More to make the point, and I flesh it out with a lot of archival material that happened to be translated into English. So and how the thinking. How German thinking on the Eastern Front, not one, was so influential in laying the foundations for the Holocaust in the East, where it started in World War II. And I've got some connections that I just most recently, before I left, in fact, looking at Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf, who supports the connection. In his writings, he supports the connection. Now, I'm not the first who made that connection, but I'm the first who's, I think, going to make a big deal out of it. That is, fleshing it out, making it, having depth to it, not simply a throwaway comment that, I won't say throwaway, but a comment by one historian, German historian, is very good, by the way. And they got me thinking along these lines. So I'm investigating that, both from that German historian's comment, as well as Martin Shaw's interpretation of how genocides happen generally, not just the Holocaust.
And I guess to follow up with this, a lot of your work in the past, it seems roughly 15 years, and you still continue to work in a number of different areas, but a lot of it has really turned to genocide, mass atrocities, and of course now political extremism. And what led you to undertake research in this area, or on these types of questions more generally?
I was trained as a physicist, actually a physical chemist, to come down to it. I was a chemistry major, a physics minor, and then I got a master's in physics at night while working as an engineer during the day. And my wife caught me reading The Spanish Civil War by Hugh Thomas and realized that my interest lay elsewhere when I should have been studying for the finals. I came out all right. I got a master's in physics at Stevens Institute of Technology while working during the day, but my interests clearly were not there. So I changed fields, and in doing it, I didn't know I wanted to go into history or political science. So I took a lot of history courses and political science courses. History, mainly Russian area work. I was thinking of actually majoring in Russian history, getting a PhD in Russian history, possibly at Columbia. That was one thought I had. Or doing something else, and the course I took in political behavior actually advised me to maximize my mathematical technical skills. And I went to Northwestern, which at the time was among the top 3 places in the country for what was called at the time behavioral research: Yale, Stanford, and Northwestern. In fact, Stanford was hiring Northwestern PhDs. And Northwestern did not hire somebody that Yale hired, which is interesting at that time. So it was a good grounding, and of course then Michigan very quickly Michigan very quickly moved into that top category, but it didn't happen at the time I was applying to schools, and Dave Singer had difficulties. It was not an easy time for him in the early 60s, but by the mid to late 60s, around the time I was getting my PhD from Northwestern, Michigan was pretty firmly on the path that Singer and others had pushed forward. So, where does that leave us at this point? Revolution was something I studied, and the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Comparative Revolutions course, fascinating. That really turned me on the whole idea of revolution as being a fundamental property of politics and affecting the future in fundamental ways, highly consequential. And my exposure at Northwestern with some trips to Michigan, Dave Singer was already moving in his work, being war. So my dissertation was on war, and that became the basis for the first book on war, political violence, in the international system. But now, you ask why the Holocaust? Because, and here I have to get personal, I imagine that's appropriate.
If you wish, absolutely, it's absolutely appropriate, but only to the extent that it's appropriate for you.
It's appropriate. 2 things. One is my wife, who's a clinical psychologist, teaching at Teachers College at Columbia University. She was doing a project on rescue in the Holocaust, that is, non-Jews who helped Jews, largely Christians who helped Jews save their lives. And it's a very important project, and a lot of publication has come out of it. And then she kind of roped me in to do some work with her. That was something she published in a rather humble journal of social relations, a really unknown place, but it got cited in the annual review of sociology that I had published with her. She edited that journal, that issue of the journal, and my contribution was, in the annual review of sociology, was surprised everybody, mostly me. Didn't expect that at all. It's a sociology journal, Humboldt Journal of Social Relations, I believe it is. So that kind of success in that, and around the same time, the Rwanda genocide happened. And I was doing the Handbook of War Studies too, and I was starting to focus on identity, and this was in the late 90s, after the genocide. I thought I needed something on the genocide in there, and I started reading about it. For a chapter I did on identity and international politics. I believe that was the title of my chapter. Not one of my best known or I think best works at all, but it got me started in looking at Rwanda. And then looking at Rwanda, I started thinking about the Holocaust and about my two events, and I mentioned one of them, the Killing Trap, where I was in Israel in the mid-1950s, 54, 55, and I went to a Yom Kippur service, Day of Atonement service, with a relative who was he was through marriage. He was my aunt's husband. She died in a DP camp at the end of World War II. Family survived. I mean, none of my immediate relatives died, but they did have to flee, and then they came out of Russia at the end of the war, and they went to Israel, that branch of the family. So during the Yom Kippur service, there's a memorial service for the dead. I never heard such weeping. It was like, I was a kid of 17, and it was beyond me. I had never seen anything like that. These people, their souls were riven. It was so, I'd say, traumatic. I blocked it out for maybe decades. I only remembered it in the context of my thinking about the Holocaust, primed initially by Rwanda. And I said, wait a minute, I forgot that. Or I blocked it out. It was too painful. So that was an element. And then I also remember my grandmother. At that time there was Yiddish radio in New York, and she was sitting on maybe 7, 8 years old, and she's sitting by the radio listening, and I knew a little bit of Yiddish, a little bit, and the announcer was saying 6 Millionen Yid, that is 6 million Jews. And my grandmother's going 6 million. She was a very bright woman. She had a sense of quantity and numbers, and she was floored. And I saw that too. I heard her remark, and these things, the memories came back. I said, if I'm going to do something important before I die, or at least I think is important, is to try and explain conditions that lead to large-scale loss of life. That's basically what it's about. And I think if we as social scientists can do something serious in that area, then we are deficient in a serious sense. Because we're talking about human life, and it's the human right issue that carried to its extreme, that is the human right to live. Once you deprive the person of that, there's nothing left, literally. These are some of the issues that, along the way, I did some work on terrorism, actually with Martha Crenshaw.
Right, with Martha.
And that was the result of the office we shared at the Richardson Institute for Conflict and Peace Studies in London. The last year I was in London, moved back to Lancaster, where it originated. And so we got to know each other, and then we collaborated after we got back, actually, on this article that came out in ISQ.
So it seems that throughout your career you've worked on both explicit forms of political violence all the way up to genocide, but also forms of structural violence, including inequality,
yes.
Patterned inequality, which is some of your well-known work as well. So it's really dealt with issues of injustice in a very broad sense throughout your career.
Yes, absolutely correct. And in fact, injustice is a variable I include in the origins of political extremism that emerges from what I call an ephemeral gain. That is, there's a subordination followed by a gain followed by a loss, and I'll be talking about that at the panel this afternoon. And a sense of injustice is incurred by Germans, for example, who see their livelihoods lost in the inflation of the early 1920s after World War I. And this is after Woodrow Wilson had promised the 14 points of peace, most of which were totally abandoned in the really punitive victory that the Allies, the British and the French and Italians, imposed on the Versailles Treaty. And so after that, and then so the inflation comes after the losses, territorial losses, losses at the front, the enormous exertions, starvation at home in 1916-17. I even saw some evidence of this when I was looking at an article that was published in a German journal on probability theory that I was working with a lot at the time, and the paper was flaky. It was just coming apart. I had to be very careful turning the pages. And it wasn't that old at the time that I was working on it. It was published about 1917 in Germany, and evidence in my hands of the effects of the blockade, the Allied blockade, on Germany that led to starvation and strikes and riots and even poor paper. So the percent of injustice of here they had risen to the pinnacles of continental hegemony at the end of the 19th century. They were the continental hegemony. There was no army that was stronger than theirs. There was even no coalition that would be sure to defeat them. And in fact, Bismarck set out conditions where there wouldn't be such a coalition developing, but then he was effectively deposed by the new Kaiser, whatever. So the Germans had, from former subordination to France in the West, to Austria earlier on, they'd risen to these heights, and now they're dashed on the shoals of defeat in World War I, and a punitive victory to boot. That was not so. There was absolute, and this is what the Nazis built on. This is so a keen sense of injustice. That justice was not served to the German people at the end of World War I. When you look at radical Islam, which is also in the origins of political extremism, a sense of injustice that a great religion that once covered large swaths of Southeast Europe and of course Anatolia and the Arab states and North Africa, all the way to the Iranian border. That was the extent of the Ottoman Empire. And you had the Caliphate in Constantinople, or later Istanbul. And this great empire and the Caliphate disappear at the end of World War I. 1924, Ataturk abolishes it, he secularizes Turkey, not interfering in private worship, but the former deep influence of Islam on the government was virtually nil. That was, in fact, Ataturk said that outright. I remember quoting him in The Killing Trap. I have seen how mullahs speak Arabic. Having spent some time in the Arabic states in the military, I can speak it better than they can. What are they doing? Educating our children in the wrong way, and that sort of thing. So you have this decline, rapid decline of Islam beginning in the 18th century. I mean, of the political representation of Islam in the Ottoman Empire and other areas of the world. Indonesia is under Dutch control. The British Raj is governing India and today's Pakistan. So that huge swaths of the Muslim world, with the exception of Iran, that was under some British influence but still independent, and some areas of Africa, not even that much. They were all under Western control. So radical Islam came about a sense of injustice that this was done to this great religion, mainly by the West. Who are the culprits in this? The Muslim Brotherhood arose in 1928 in the Suez area of Egypt that the British governed at that time. British troops were there, and that's precisely the location of the Muslim Brotherhood that now governs Egypt. At that point, a violent organization. They renounced violence in the early 1980s. They actually had not practiced violence since the 1970s. Now they're actually somewhat more conservative than other Salafist types in Egypt who are opposed to Morsi's accommodating ways to the Americans, to the Israelis, or whatever.
And of course, this experience of loss, of moving from a point of high power to a point of loss, is something you've also written on in the case of specifically the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian genocide and the Committee of Union and Progress, which was particularly concerned about its loss of authority space.
Yeah. Or Rwanda.
Or Rwanda with the Hutu power regime.
Yeah, the Hutu were in power, and this is after the Tutsis had governed for a very long time, and including as handmaidens to the Belgians when the Belgians were the colonial authorities. And this is threatened to be lost totally, as it was in fact when Kagame and the RPF won the war.
And so, looking back at the evolution of the field, and by field I mean conflict studies field, broadly speaking, over the course of your career, what issues or what areas do you think should have received more attention in the field? Or are there areas that you think should have received more attention? And some of these things change over time because the world changes, and so new questions receive new attention. But are there areas that you think should have received more attention from scholars?
I haven't thought seriously about this, but I am in the moment now, and I think it's why certain populations are willing to tolerate autocratic rule for so long. You've got that in North Korea. You've got people starving. Now we give the explanation that the military is getting what it needs, they're well fed, they're the most institutionalized, they're the most powerful institution by far in the whole North Korean society. But still, why is the population not more restive? Not the whole population is tied in with the military. The Middle East raises these questions. Why were these Arab populations so willing to accommodate to autocratic rulers? Virtually all of the major states of the Middle East. And we're finding a difficulty now in dealing with the Syrian situation with Assad. But I think that's one.
So more attention to cases of autocratic cases that there was no revolution
that persisted.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really part of the whole protraction thing that I'm getting involved in. Mm-hmm. Why certain conflicts protract over a long period of time? Well, one can ask the obverse question of why certain conflicts or conflicts don't occur, but that certain types of rule persist. We know why democracies persist, simply people have their say, but autocracies also persist, and people don't have their say. And one asks a question about the Soviet Union: would it have imploded as it did without, number one, the pressure of the Western arms race that the Reagan administration was provoking, and their realization that technologically they were vastly inferior to us, plus the extraordinary economic difficulties in the society. When I was there just at the end of the Soviet period, 1990, the line for McDonald's went around the box several times because I couldn't buy meat anywhere. I was taken to a restaurant by a member of the Communist Party, and all there was, I happened to order Ukrainian beef, and it turned out that was the only thing they had. Everybody else was ordering something else, and they didn't have any. They were the only society in the 1980s, supposedly in the developed world, where longevity was declining. That is, every other society of whatever regime type, of the first world or second world, longevity was increasing. However, minimally. In the case of the Soviet Union, no, it was actually declining. So this society in deep trouble. And yet the people themselves weren't doing much about it. And it took a lot of these external stresses and an internal reform by Gorbachev, the idea of glasnost, the perestroika, that finally began to energize the people. So our population so inert until these either leadership-driven or externally driven stresses arrive? I mean, this is something that...
This raises profound questions of politics, right?
Yes,
about political order. Are there any questions or topics in the field over the course of your career that you've seen in the field that perhaps should have received less attention? In other words, are there questions or topics that you think perhaps scholars focused on for a bit much?
I tend not to ever try to derogate my colleagues and what they choose to do. I think all of it's of some importance, and I'm hesitant to point fingers and say, because a lot of scholarship is saying, we're looking at my research community such as it is, I look at some others and I say, dealing with something trivial here. For those people, it's not trivial. It's important to them for one reason or another. I may not acknowledge that importance, but I'm not them. So it's one reason I hesitate to condemn anyone or to.
If you had done an interview like this when you were in mid-career, who would you have liked to interview? Who would have been some of the major scholars at the time who were influential for you, who you would like to have sat down with?
Karl Deutsch.
Karl Deutsch?
Absolutely. He was a titan. You don't hear his name much now, but he just enormous contribution. Absolutely incredible. First MIT, then Yale, then Harvard. He was really quite, to this day, I cite some of his work on developments of we feeling, the political community in the North Atlantic area, the idea of being able to understand how certain communities get together because of their prediction of common fate. They sense they're all in the same boat together, and that makes an important, cement for political community. And the problems of the EU, parenthetically now, are that people don't think they're in the same boat. They don't share this common fate. France and Germany did at the start of the EU, way back in the coal and steel community, when they first got together with Italy and the Benelux countries, that we can't have another war like World War II. What are we doing here? We're destroying ourselves. Common fate. And Deutsch wisely picked up on that. Those sentiments are not rife any longer. The World War II was a long time ago. Nobody expects there to be a war, even if the EU collapses, which I don't think it will, but who knows. So I think Deutsch was someone I would really like to have interviewed. Someone whose work I really did not emulate, but who I respect a lot, William Riker. I thought he was instrumental in having an article of mine rejected from the APSR, if for no reason that it wasn't the kind of thing he did. It was a probabilistic model. In fact, the one that wound up predicting the Reagan and later somebody else using it, the Bush second-term victory. But it was published in somewhat different form. I revised it on my own, sent it back, and it was accepted. So it did see the light of day. But Riker really, he tried to indicate to me that he wanted he held no ill will. And so in those days when you had papers, that you were delivering, people bought the papers. No such thing as now with the web and all that. And so the piles would go down, and one paper I was delivering at the APSA, there's a sign-up list for you to send the paper to them because they'd run out at the convention. And Bill Riker signed his name in big letters that he wanted me to send him a copy of his paper. I thought that was a generous.
Yeah.
He died not too long after. I think when you get older, I think you sort of want to mend your fences, and maybe he did respect what I did. I don't know. We never talked. But I would love to have interviewed because he also did something I really admired enormously, taking a department like Rochester that really was nothing. turning into a powerhouse of political science.
Right, rational choice, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Whether I agree or disagree, and elements of The Killing Trap, I criticize rational choice for the study of genocide and emotion-driven kinds of events. I still admire what he did. He was a great figure. I think I would also, even though I knew David Singer pretty well, I wasn't his close buddy, but I think I would like to interview David Singer on this kind of one-to-one basis and so on. Because I understood a lot about him. I'm sure I didn't understand everything about him. That would have been very useful. These are the major figures in my career that I can't. I'm sure when I leave here, I'll think of a whole bunch of others, but at this point, it's
Great. And what do you think are the most exciting or promising areas in current research right now in conflict studies? Again, broadly understood.
I think the general field of human rights, but more particularly mass killing studies, genocide, other forms of mass violence, and Civil War research. I think study of interstate war has gotten less attention recently. I wouldn't say it's moribund. That's not my point. But I think the Civil War and ethnic conflict, those areas, I think have just gotten great attraction in recent years for good reason. There's a lot more of it, and nobody's running around predicting that we're going to have a major interstate war in the near future. As you can see, I've been almost totally oriented to conflict, and that's been it started out in graduate school when I started preparing for going out to Northwestern, and it's continuing.
It's interesting you bring this up because, of course, genocide studies, to the extent that it's a kind of a field, something that's really taken off over the past somewhere about 15-ish years, more or less. And the study of civil wars, it seems a lot of international relations scholars in particular moved away from studying interstate war to now studying civil war. So there's been a real shift in a number of different areas that's attracting different types of scholarly communities. It's become very rich because of that.
Yes, and there's an osmosis between it. That is, when you study civil war, you tend to think, well, in the extreme, what happens in civil war, you get, like in Rwanda, you get genocide. The Russian Civil War, in many ways, that occurred at the end of World War I between the Bolsheviks and the so-called white Russians. They flew the white Tsar's flag, I think that's what they call whites. And that Civil War really set the stage in many ways for the production of genocide in World War II. Because, and I mentioned this in The Killing Trap, a necessary condition for genocide is establishing the vulnerability of a victim. And Jews were vulnerable, and they were killed in large numbers at the end, in that Civil War period, particularly by white armies, much less so by Bolshevik armies, and it really led to an influence. And in The Killing Trap, I detail that influence, by the way. I detail it in terms of how Ukrainians in particular were influenced by genocidal thinking, and then the Germans saw that this was going on in Ukraine, this kind of sentiment, deeply and virulently anti-Semitic sentiment, and then they could act with impunity later when they had the power to do so.
Yeah, it strikes me too also that you and a few other scholars have really attempted to bring different areas of different areas of political violence together to try to think about how they may connect to one another. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of people who work, such as yourself, on genocide, but also try to think about the place of genocide in relationship to war. Yeah. Timothy Snyder, of course, recently wrote the book Bloodlands, which is
in fact, that is heavily influential in the thing I was talking to you before about World War I. That is because Bloodlands and the territory of Bloodlands and the territory of the Holocaust are virtually coterminous and affected by the German army's policies in World War I. and particularly towards the end. And so this is what Timothy Snyder's book energized me to a certain extent.
Yeah, but it still seems like that's an area that's still open to a lot more production of work. There's still a lot of research
Oh yes,
that is yet to be done on thinking
yes.
about the intersection of these different kinds of violence and why they overlap, under what conditions do they overlap, how do they reinforce one another.
That's right.
And I'm thinking here also of Donald Bloxham's work you may be familiar with.
Yes, less so.
Less
I
so.
know of him,
Yeah.
but a little less because he's off at Edinburgh. I should make the effort, but they're
Well, thank you very much for this. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you about your own work and about kind of your sense of the field and of your career, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have done this and delighted to talk with you.
Thank you.